We do a weird thing. That's really not fair. I do a weird thing. I've been preaching here up front for 5 years, and one of the things that I sat with the elders when they wanted to do this weird thing of having me. I'm a business owner. I own cancer centers with a buddy of mine who goes to the church here. And I'm the lead teaching pastor, kind of volunteer, which will probably be very obvious to you if you're new in about 15 minutes. And one of the things I said that I won't do is I won't tailor my messages for things. I'm just going to teach what God wants me to teach. And so whatever we hit with on Sunday, that's what we're going to do. We are a church, and especially if you've been here the last few months, I believe the resurrection is every day. I believe the resurrection is every week. Now, I think this is a very high holy day, and I think we need to recognize it as such. But we'll be in Romans 16 today, which is not your typical Easter passage, but it's way better than when I was in the book of Judges, and the woman got murdered and sent out to 12 sections of Israel. That was a tough one to bring back to the resurrection. Then we were in Luke 1 year, we were in Acts 1 year, I don't even remember. And so this is kind of a pinnacle morning for me. We've been in the letter to the Roman church that Paul wrote in the 50s AD. And we've been doing this study for about 9 months. And today is the last talk. And every time we do this, it's kind of like Russian roulette for me, because about January, I just can't take it anymore, and I have to look ahead to see what God's going to land me on, especially after the whole woman murder scene that I had to go through 4 years ago. And so I looked at it and went, okay, this is weird. The last talk that I gave last year was on Easter Sunday, and we finished the book of the Acts of the Apostles. This morning we're finishing the letter to the Romans on this Sunday. And of course, because I just had to do it to raise my stress level, I started reading through Romans 16 and immediately said to God, what are we going to do with this mess? How will we ever come up with a sermon for Romans 16? So we'll see how that goes this morning. If you have a Bible, grab it. If you don't, there's Bibles all around you, in the chairs, in the slots. If you'll recall, Paul wrote this letter, like I said, in the 50s AD, mid-50s AD. He's been ministering as a worshiper of Jesus, if you will, and following the calling of God on his life to basically share the gospel with Jews and Gentiles, mostly outside of Jerusalem, and to plant churches. This church in Rome is rather unique because Rome is, as you know at this time, it's the center of the known universe. It's a massive city of 1 million people. And in antiquity, that is a huge city. And most scholars believe that the number of believers, the sum total of believers in Rome at this time was around 100. Now, let's say they're wrong by tenfold. Let's say there's 1,000 believers. 1,000 believers, which I don't think there were, in a city of 1 million, under the reign of Nero. It's a unique church, too, because Paul did not start these churches, and Paul has never visited these churches. They're churches that meet in houses, and there's no more than maybe 10, 12, 13, 14 people in a group. So they're just house churches that meet on the Sabbath, on Saturdays, around the city, and it's made up of Jews and Gentiles. Paul hasn't gone to see these people yet. He will in about 3 years. He writes this letter from the city of Corinth in modern-day Greece, and he'll eventually get there. Unfortunately, when Paul gets to Rome, he's chained under Roman guard, under house arrest, and the people in these house churches have to actually come to visit him. He's waiting to go see the emperor, the Caesar of Rome, Nero himself. And these churches are struggling to get along with each other. They're struggling to figure out how it is the Jews and the Gentiles belong together in these churches. And they're struggling for different reasons. The Gentiles are looking at the Jewish followers of Jesus, and they're saying this. There have been 2 emperors that have kicked you Jewish people out of Rome in the last 20 years. clearly God's hand is not on you anymore. On top of that, the Jews, as a large body, are not believing in Jesus as their Messiah, some 20 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. The Gentile followers of Jesus look at this and they say, clearly God is done with you. This is the era of the Gentile. Unfortunately, this ridiculous, cruddy thinking has been pervasive all the way to today. It's why we had people like Hitler, for heaven's sake, or the Crusades that took place. The Jews hear this, that are following Jesus, and they think to themselves, if that's true, if God is actually done with us, then God cannot be counted on to keep his promises. And if God can't promise something and then keep it, well, then he is not God at all. And we want nothing to do with it. You see, the problem as Jew and Gentile in these weird churches, kind of like our bizarre little church here, of people from all over the Bay Area, and people of every race, which is strange for Alamo, by the way. The problem in these little house churches was literally not with each other. It stemmed mostly from their issue with God himself. You see, if God cannot be counted on to do what he... The parking lot's bad. It's great. I'm sorry. I just thought it was kind of good. If God cannot be counted on, first and foremost, to do what he promises in the Old Testament, then he can be relied on for nothing. You see, 3,500 years ago, 1,500 years prior to Paul writing this letter, God met a dude from Ur named Abraham. And he said, here's the deal, Abraham, and all the way back in Genesis 12. I am going to raise you up. I'm going to turn you into a person I'm going to call a Jew. I'm going to raise a nation out of you, and I'm going to save the world through you. If God does not fulfill just that one single promise that he spoke through Abraham and to Abraham, then God cannot be counted on. On top of that, these house churches were not only wondering whether God would be faithful to what he promised and how he has been faithful to what he promised, but they, like today, they look at the world that they lived in and they said it's a complete train wreck. How? You know, we refer to Jesus, particularly on Easter, as the King of Kings. This phrase means literally the King of all kings, the King above every king. Well, if he's the King of all kings, then why does our world look like it does? This is what they were struggling with. So Paul sets out in chapter 3, verse 21, all the way to the end of chapter 11, to exonerate God, to prove that God has in fact been faithful to what he promised, and he has done it primarily through the coming of Messiah. And then before Paul does that, he says, let's just do one thing before I defend God from chapter 3 to chapter 11. Let me make one thing perfectly clear, Paul says in chapter 1 and 2. We are actually the guilty party. We are the ones that deserve to be on the trial. We are the ones that have messed this world up. And we are the ones that have not come through. And then, and I think we've all done this at some point in our life, then, and this Roman churches did it too, we have the audacity, after messing this world up, messing our marriages up, messing our kids up, messing our work situations up, messing our lives up, we have the audacity to then turn to God and say, what's your problem? Why haven't you fixed this place? Despite that fact, God essentially sits on the witness stand and is interrogated. And Paul, as his sort of defense lawyer, proves that God has indeed been faithful. And then in chapter 12, Paul switches, having proven God has come through, and having proven that Jesus is indeed the King and is fixing life one life at a time. He then turns to these churches in chapter 12, and for the next 4 chapters, in chapter 12 to 15, he tells them, now, based on how kind God has been to you, this is what you should do for one another. The idea that we derived from this a few weeks ago is we don't owe one another to love one another. We owe it to God. You see, God has welcomed me, therefore I will welcome you. God has provided for me, therefore I will give to you. God has overlooked my sin, therefore I will overlook yours. God has forgiven me, I will forgive you. God does not judge me, I will not judge you. It all flows from what God has done for me and the great welcoming of the Messiah. This morning we're going to close this massive letter of Paul's out in chapter 16. And this is the dilemma that these churches faced, and this is the dilemma that we face today, I think. Jesus resurrects. What does that mean? Well, the concept in Romans is this. Jesus was the one in Genesis 1 and 2 that the Bible says breathed life into existence. I don't care how he did it, and the Bible actually leaves that more open than the church likes to make it sound like. But he breathed life into existence. We are the creation of Jesus himself. Literally in the Bible. Look at Colossians if you want to see that. When Jesus dies and he resurrects, the idea that is painted in the New Testament is that the Father is on the throne, Jesus is to his right-hand side, the Father lifts the crown off of his head, places it on Jesus at his resurrection, and says, you are crowned king. You are the one to rightfully put this place back together. You are the King of Kings. You are the honorable one that lived your life on behalf of humanity. You're the one that breathed the world into existence. Now you fix it. They broke it. You fix it. And Jesus takes up this charge and begins to put the world back together one life at a time. And I, Doug McBride, for anybody that has known me in my life, am testimony to that fact. We cling to this reality. We cling to the reality that Jesus is the King of Kings, and he is in fact ruling and restoring life. And yet the world we live in is crashing in on us. Tuesday, my knucklehead group of friends and I that have lunch, there's about 6 of us every Tuesday. We get in the car, and as is the case, we meet at my office here in Livorno, and 3 or 4 of us are in the car, and we're calling the other guys to say what restaurant we're going to. And we knew that our fireman buddy Doug Abbott was supposed to be there. And we called Doug, and he said, we're going to Pete's Brass Rail. And Doug said, I'm out. We said, what do you mean you're out? I talked to you 5 minutes ago. You were in 5 minutes ago. What do you mean you're out? I mean, he's a fireman. It's, you know, he works like 2 days a year. And we remind him of that all the time. He said, well, I was just down in Alamo, and I ran into another fireman from Oakland, and he just told me one of our fireman brothers' daughters never woke up. Many of you know this story that took place this week, or last week. High school girl in our town. Doug Abbott, here's a cup of cold water. He raced to the pizza place, got a half a dozen pizzas, and walked in. He walked in, by the way, with an Oakland priest. And Doug said, I couldn't even put the food down. This guy, with all the house full of firemen, ran to me and just lost it on my shoulder. This is the reality of life. Is it not? Greg Armstrong. I go to the bike shop yesterday. I'm visiting with Jose in Danville. He says, did you hear about this gal, Monica? I said, I don't know Monica. He said, I know you know she is. She rode bikes all the time, and I ride all the time. He said, she's the one with the giant hair. She's kind of small. I go, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've passed her many times. Her husband died 2 or 3 years ago of ALS, 2 kids. She went on a ride the other day, came home at 49, and dropped dead of heart. And now 2 kids in this town have no parents. What do we do with this? Jesus is the crowned king of all kings, restoring life, and yet the world is in just turmoil and suffering. This is the exact stressor that Paul points out in Romans. Listen to these 2 separate verses. Romans 8:28, a very famous verse, says this. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. We looked at this extensively months ago. This does not mean all things are good. This does not also mean all things are from God. He does have an enemy, by the way. It also does not mean that all things work together for good for me. We sing this song with this verse in it, and it actually says that, and every time I sing it, I have to stop because I won't say that word. This verse does not promise that God will work all things together for good for me. His promise is, I will work all things, chaotic even, for the good of this world. It means God will redeem and make life out of death. It means God is the God who raises dead things. He started with his Son and he kept going. And it does not mean that every time I see tragedy, and boy does this make my skin crawl, as it should yours. Every time I see tragedy and then somebody says, God's got a plan, is if God is just sitting up there with a shotgun going, cancer, right? Death, disease, failed marriage. No, the enemy is wreaking havoc, and God sees that chaos, and God steps into this muck and creates beauty somehow out of mud. But the flip side is also true in Romans. Listen to Romans 8:22 and 23. For we know that all of creation has been groaning together with the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. This is a brutal place we live in. Kids are under massive pressure. We were having dinner again with Jen and Doug Abbott last night. Jen's a 4th grade teacher. And, she was talking about a 4th grade kid who had a 3.3, but now it's a 3.1. And I stopped her during dinner. I said, they have grades in 4th grade? I mean, isn't it just variations of smiley faces? You're only going to get a star and a half? This is all new to me. Well, only in Alamo and Danville, we need grades, right? We need prep school, right? For Harvard and MIT in 4th grade, stressed out. Marriage is stressed. Money. We groan. Disease and hardship. Loneliness. It's a miracle that we see even occasionally the beauty of God in our day. It is the greatest testimony that God is alive, that you ever see something good in your day. This is exactly what these churches in Rome needed to hear and were experiencing. Paul closes out this magnificent letter to the Roman church with a doxology. How many of you, I grew up Lutheran, how many of you grew up either Catholic or Lutheran, maybe more of a liturgical background? Raise your hand. Yeah, a doxology is this kind of traditional, if you will, praise of God, to uplift God. This is how Paul closes the letter. If you have your Bibles open, we'll turn to verse 25 in chapter 16. This is what Paul says to close this unbelievable masterpiece. Now to him who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Messiah, according to the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages, but has now been revealed or disclosed, and through the prophetic writings has been made known to all the nations, according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith. To the only wise God be glory forevermore through Jesus Messiah. Amen. Verse 25, listen to what it says again. Now to him who is able to strengthen you, he says, according to my gospel, Paul says, and the preaching of Jesus Messiah, according to the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages. 2 parts to this statement.
in verse 25. And we'll take them in reverse order. First of all, what does this mean? According to the revelation of the mystery that has been kept secret for long ages. This gospel, this word, the gospel, is the mystery that was hidden, that is now made known in the resurrection of Jesus. The gospel. When we hear this term gospel, most of us who have been in church far too long, all we think about is the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. That is not the gospel. That is the culmination of the gospel. That is the coup de grace of the gospel. That is the completion and the fulfillment of the gospel. The gospel is the long story of God reaching out to a world that insists on imploding upon itself. The gospel is God coming to Abraham saying, I will put this place back together and I will do it through you. This is the gospel, culminating in Jesus, the one who would die for the sins of humanity, and then indwell us personally with His Spirit to give us life and purpose and vitality and a sense of belonging. King Jesus, the long-kept secret, unveiling how God has actually been faithful to what He promised. Birth through a Jewish woman. Why is that important? Because God promised He would save the world through Israel. And when Israel refused to do it, God said, no problem, then we'll do it. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit get together. They literally birthed one of their own, Jesus, through a Jewish woman to fulfill the promise that God made through Abraham 3,500 years ago, that God would restore humanity through a Jew. Resurrected after He's killed. God has a plan, and His plan gets killed. The plan, by the way, is His Son. And God resurrects His plan, telling all of us, if you simply turn to me once in your life and offer your faith to me, I will come into you and dwell with you for eternity. And by the way, Jesus didn't just resurrect. This is something that was huge in the study of Romans. Romans calls Him the first fruits of the resurrection. What a fantastically crazy phrase. Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. Jesus initiated resurrection. See, Jesus resurrected and He began resurrecting over and over and over again. And again, I am testimony of that. At 18 years old, I turned to Jesus at 18 and a half in Berkeley and said, I give up. I have tried everything but you. Let's give you a shot. And Jesus resurrected my life. He is the first fruits of resurrection. Jesus working tirelessly to change our world one life at a time. And if you don't know if that's true, come to this church for a few weeks and you'll see. He is the mystery that was not made known and is now made known to all of us. That's the second half of this phrase. So what is the first half? Paul says, now to Him who is able to strengthen you. The strengthen means to renew your energy and vitality, to give you elasticity back in your life. This was Paul's goal from the start. He said this literally all the way back in chapter 1, verse 11. To strengthen these Roman believers in Jesus. Paul has a deep conviction in his soul that only God, only the God he serves, is able to accomplish this. Only God strengthens truly. Only Jesus can lift us out of our guilt and shame. Only Jesus can take His life of living perfectly and hand it to a schmuck like me and say, don't worry, the pressure's off of you, Doug. You get my obedience. So that every time Satan stands before God and says, look at that guy. Have you seen how he just treated his wife? Jesus says, oh, no, that's not his life. I gave him my life already. He gets my perfection. Only Jesus can raise dead things. Plans, ideas, people's lives. Only Jesus can make sense out of our suffering. and heal and comfort and reach spots in our heart that nobody else even knows are there. The people in Rome that Paul calls his brothers and sisters, these Jews and Gentiles, these 100 strong, and a city of 1 million, they needed this deeply. They gave their lives to follow Jesus, and it's not exactly working out. Their emperor is Nero, for heaven's sake. And the one before them was Claudius, and he just got done kicking the Jews out of Rome and out of their homes for 6 straight years. Paul's letters always close with a set of greetings. All of chapter 16 almost is just, tell Susie I said hi, and, tell Johnny I left the oven on, and it's just a bunch of greetings. And there's a lot of them. In fact, there are more greetings in Romans 16 to people that Paul gives than all the other letters Paul writes combined. 27 of them. 40% of them are ladies, by the way, if you want to know how God kind of felt even back then. Way too many for us to look at this morning. I want to just quickly highlight just 4 of these 27 people to illustrate this point of living between the pain of suffering and the hope and expectancy that Jesus resurrects dead things. Chapter 16, look at verse 3. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Messiah Jesus. They risked their necks for my life, he says, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks for these 2 people as well. Greet also the church that meets in Priscilla and Aquila's houses. We don't know what it means exactly that they risked their necks. But these were people that lived in Rome that Claudius kicked out of Rome and had no home. So they traveled down to Corinth where Paul meets them. And it was blowing up in Corinth. And Paul, there were riots, there were court cases, there was all this anti-Jewish sentiment, particularly against Paul. So somehow, these 2 people stood in front of Paul to protect him. Huge weight and pressure. And then they go home and take the risk of having a church that meets in their home with Nero as their Caesar. Look at verse 7. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my kinsmen and my fellow prisoners. Andronicus and Junia. At some point in another, these 2 people, and more than likely because simply they believed in Jesus, were thrown in prison, and that's where they meet Paul, who seemed to go to prison all the time. And they become friends. These are people that know hardship. They're not in prison because they're evading taxes. They're in prison because they follow Jesus. Junia, by the way, almost every commentator agrees, is a female name, by the way. She's an apostle. So I'll let you noodle that around. Verse 11. Greet those in the Lord who belong to the family of Narcissus. Now this isn't the Greek mythology Narcissus. It's one of 2 people in history. Most scholars believe that this Narcissus was a particular individual that rose to great power under the reign of Claudius. As it always was in this case, when the emperor was friends with you and you and your family rose to power, there were way more many people in power that hated you for it. Claudius dies, and they go after Narcissus, assassinate him, and when that happens, they confiscated all your property, and then they went after every single family member of yours to kill him. So when Paul makes a little statement, greet those in the Lord who belong to the family of Narcissus, this isn't just tell them hi. These are people who are literally being hunted to be murdered because of their fault. And here's my favorite. Oh, I dig this guy. Erastus, verse 23. Erastus, the city treasurer, and our brother Quartus, they greet you. He says, Erastus. Paul wrote this letter from Corinth. He says, there's a guy here with me by the name of Erastus. Some of you know him, Roman Christians. He's the city treasurer, to remind you. He says hi. Looks like nothing. Corinth was a city, it's a fantastic place to visit. It's a city that was about 100,000 or 800,000 strong, a huge city. And it was a weird situation because there's a big bay, and they would sail into the Bay of Corinth, and then there was what they call an isthmus, which was a little landmass. And what they would do is the sailors would park their ships like in a row, and then they would wait for several weeks at a time until it was their ship's turn. Then they would unload the ship, and then slaves would take all of their cargo, carry it across this little thin isthmus, which you can actually see from one side to the other side of the ocean. They would literally carry the ship, put the ship back in the water, load the ship, and the sailors would go on. Well, the sailors had all kinds of time on their hands. Weeks. Well, this worked out perfectly. And they had money in their pockets. Well, it just so happened that Corinth, their greatest money maker, was the temple to Aphrodite. There were 1,000 temple prostitutes in Corinth. Now, I want you to catch this. Erastus, who had to be a local, he's a native of Corinth, is appointed by the Caesar himself. He's the treasurer of the city, whose main moneymaker is 1,000 temple prostitutes. And, unfortunately for him, in one sense, he gives his life to Jesus. Now, can you imagine this guy going, what do I do with this? I want to be faithful to Jesus, but I'm the city treasurer, and all the money's coming from prostitution for these sailors. Not an easy life. Throw that picture up for me, will you? For those of you that don't think there's any evidence for the Bible. This, you can even read the top left. This is a stone that they have unearthed in Corinth that says it's from the exact time frame when Paul wrote this. That says Erastus, the treasurer appointed by Rome over the city of Corinth. Isn't that crazy? This guy had real problems. Real problems. And by the way, this was Paul's life. The guy writing to try to encourage these people, clinging to the strength of Jesus in the midst of brutal and horrible suffering and pressure. This is why in verse 25 Paul says, now to him who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel. This is my gospel, he says. It's deeply personal to Paul. Remember, it's so funny, this is what we looked at last Easter when we finished out the book of Acts. You remember this murderer, Paul? He was actually going house to house, dragging out Jesus followers and having them stoned to death. He heads to Syria, on the road to Damascus, to kill more Jews and Gentiles that are going to give their life to Jesus. And Jesus meets him on the road and says, not a good idea. Paul gives his life to follow Jesus. He follows the mission to start planting churches outside of Israel. And listen to how his life works out. He goes to Antioch, and there's riots. He goes to Lystra. They drag him out by the scruff of his neck. They stone him to an inch of his life. They stone him so bad, they think he's dead. They kick him a few times. There's no life left in him, and they walk back in the city. Somehow, Paul wakes back up. His friends dust him off, and what does that crazy guy do? He walks right back in. Like, yep, I'm still alive, I'm still breathing. Who else can I tell about Jesus? He goes to Philippi. He's beaten, he's tied up, and he's imprisoned without a trial. He's a Roman citizen. He goes to Thessalonica. There's more riots. He goes to Berea. He's run out of town. He goes to Corinth, court cases, anti-Jewish revolt. He goes to Ephesus. 25,000 pagans in unison are shouting for his death. After he writes this letter, he goes back to Jerusalem, where he's rejected by his own people, the people he grew up with, the people he studied with, maybe even his own family members. He's beaten and imprisoned for several years. And this doesn't even touch what happened to Paul when he was traveling. Most scholars estimate that Paul actually hiked 8,000 miles by foot in sandals and a robe. 8,000 miles. That's going across the U.S. twice. It's the diameter of our planet. 20 miles a day was the most you could probably do. And by the way, I've been on these roads. They're not good roads. You drive through Turkey especially. I mean, I'm talking about snow-capped, rugged, brutal. And there's not like, the Hampton Inn. I mean, you're sleeping in the snow on the side of the road and just throwing your cloak over you. And then he gets treated how he gets treated. Scholars estimate that Paul was on a ship passing through the sea for over 3,000 miles, shipwrecked multiple times, multiple nights in the sea. This is a guy that needs hope. This is a guy that needs strength from something way beyond himself. This is a guy that needs to be connected to the one who raises dead things. This is why, by the way, we don't find Paul wallowing in self-pity, downcast and frustrated and having no perspective and saying, I quit. Paul, as you read him, it takes a while to get used to him. He's almost frustrating because he's so otherworldly in his perspective. He in the midst of his suffering, has raised so high above it, it's hard to figure out. Paul's life was resurrected by Jesus. And Paul's life rests on the one that both resurrected and resurrects that which is around him. I love what he said in Philippians 3:8. Indeed, I count everything as lost because of the surpassing worth of just knowing Jesus. Everything after that is nothing. This is how fulfilling and strengthening knowing Jesus is my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of pretty much everything. And I count it as rubbish in order that I might still know him. Our hope rests on the same thing, amen? We have access through Jesus to the same God who alone strengthens. Our strength, our internal peace, our sense of life and purpose, our hope rests on the resurrection. Not just that Jesus resurrected, but that Jesus now resurrects. Our hope rests on this day that death was overturned through the power of his Spirit. And not just Jesus' death, but my death and yours. Our lives that experience death. What does the story of resurrection say to a lost world that is imploding on itself? Well, first of all, he's alive. And we look at one another's lives and we say, your testimony before me that God is resurrected. But the other part of this answer is difficult. We wait. We live between these trees, between the suffering and heartache of life and brutality of what we watch in other people's lives and in our own, and the expectant hope that Jesus can raise that which dies. Our plans, our ideas, our friends, our family, ourselves.